One of the most dangerous things for a man is to be too long without danger. I don't know if you've thought of it that way, to realize what it can mean to a person. The problem is that the longer you are in a condition of not facing danger, the more likely you are to forget that you have enemies or that bad things could happen to you. You're more prone to let your guard down. And so to not face danger for a period of time can be, in itself, a dangerous situation and can add a great deal to danger. Someone has said that peace is mere nothing more than an interval between wars. And certainly if you look at the history of man, you would have to consider that there probably have been much more time of war than there has been of peace. And therefore that statement is not altogether invalid. So, it is dangerous, and it can be dangerous, to be too long away from risk, from danger, from hazard. It is interesting that in a short period of time, and the period of time between World War I and World War II is much shorter than the time we've had since World War II, that people decided, I guess, or came to feel that they didn't really have any enemies anymore, that the world was going to go through a long period of time of peace. And they were, for a period of time, out of danger. And the euphoria that set in subsequent to World War I was remarkable, certainly much more remarkable than anything that happened subsequent to World War II. People talked about that was the war that would end all wars, that we would have, as Chamberlain said, so strangely, peace in our time, as he said when he came back from Munich, which was one of the most disastrous meetings ever conducted by a British head of state. It was a time when most people believed that there would never be another war, certainly not of the likes that they had been through before. And so they were unable or unwilling somehow, as Hitler began to rise to a position of power, to realize that the man was an enemy. It is not always easy to know who your enemies are and to know where the danger lies and to be able to recognize clearly and distinctly where this enemy is. Now, the Bible is replete with examples that are illustrations of warfare. We are called soldiers by Paul. Isn't that interesting? One of the fine old hymns that we all love to sing, Onward Christian Soldiers. And it is strange that the Prince of Peace is pictured in the Bible as a great warrior. And I think it's important, and Paul seems to be trying to drive it home consistently, as do the prophets, as a matter of fact, that the man who would serve God has, at all times, an enemy. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not an enemy-oriented person. I have never really had any enemies to speak of. And I've lived most of my life feeling that people were either neutral toward me or they were their friends, or if they didn't like me, they were willing to let me alone, and I still don't consider that to be an enemy. And I just never really thought that much of having enemies. And I remember how amused I was, shocked and amused, to learn that the White House had an enemies list. They had this long list of names of people who were enemies of the Nixon administration. And I thought, that's amazing that people would think that way. And I wonder if you were to tell me right now, or were to try to listen now and say, okay, let's see, who are my enemies? I imagine a lot of you would say, well, I don't have an enemy in the world. Wrong. You do have an enemy in the world. Satan the devil. And as I said, in a time of peace, and in a time when things are going well, I'm afraid it's a little too easy to forget that you have an enemy, and to perhaps let your guard down and create a danger far greater than you otherwise might have to face. There were people between the wars who never stopped preparing for war. And it's well that they didn't, because we probably to this day owe our freedom, in a human sense, to those people. It may very certainly the British do, and I would say that the whole world would be a different place today if it were not for people like the man called Intrepid, for people like Donovan of the United States, who was the counterpart of Stevenson in Britain, who were surreptitiously, and sometimes with their own money, at great personal expense, developing not professionals, but amateurs as an intelligence network throughout Europe and throughout the world. And these people, who were among the few in this world, sensitive enough and sensible enough, far-sighted enough to realize there would be another war, and that information, knowledge, insight into the enemy would perhaps be the greatest weapon that they would have at their disposal. They began to prepare for World War II right after World War I. They had to keep their activities secret from their own government because there were people who would have put them out, who would have shut them down, and who would have stopped their activities. There were people who tried to advocate the preparation for defense. They wanted to develop new weapons. They wanted to experiment with new aircraft and new types of aircraft. They wanted to enlarge the weapons industry. There were many people who said, we'd better not. It might look like we're preparing for war, and we might antagonize Hitler. There were people who said, well, we need to expand our intelligence network. There were people who said, we better not. It will look like we're preparing for war. It will be an act of hostility. It will be interpreted as an act of hostility. And it may antagonize our enemy, or a potential enemy. There were people who said, better not. They got to where they called them the better notters, because they were always saying, well, you better not do that, you better not take care of this, you better not do the other thing. And so people were afraid to manufacture weapons. They were afraid to develop networks. And essentially, Chamberlain and other people in his administration, in fact, I would say the majority of the people, at least in public life at that time, were, in their way of thinking, in their way of looking at it, they were playing it safe. They were going to take the course that looked like it would be the safe course. They did not wish to take the risk that would be involved. Meanwhile, inside of Europe, the pressure was beginning to mount daily upon the Jews. Many of them had not just subtle hints, but outright acts of violence performed against them. They began to realize, and there were some who had read Hitler's works on the subject and knew what it was that he intended, but they did not take him seriously. And it was a scary thing to them to leave their home and to leave their country and to pack their goods and to leave and to go into a place they had never seen before. It was scary. Many of them didn't know whether they even had a place to go. And so they played it safe. They didn't take the risk, and it was a risk, of course, to get up and leave your home and your people and go somewhere else. They thought they were playing it safe, and they stayed put, and they hoped for a better day tomorrow. And the danger to them was so subtle and built so slowly over a period of time that the door was closed on them before they knew that it was closed. And finally, when some of them decided to make the move was no longer available to them. And finally, they gave their lives or lost their lives in a gas chamber. And finally, their bodies were burned in an oven. And interestingly enough, along the way, they thought they were taking a safe course of action. Now, I wonder, there are people who are basically risk-oriented people. They are prone to take risks and take chances. There are other people who are more security conscious and tend to like to play it safe. I wonder if you were to think of yourself, what personality type, would be more likely to be in the kingdom of God? The gambler? Or the super conservative, stay at home, let's play this thing safe, let's be real careful, etc. Which one of them would be more likely, do you think, to be in the kingdom of God? Now, you already realize, I'm sure, that that's a loaded question. I want you to take you back to a couple of parables. Don't answer it, because you may, be trapped by your answer if you're not careful here. To the 25th chapter of Matthew, to a very familiar parable. And I want us to take note of a couple of things in it. Matthew 25, and beginning in verse 14. For the kingdom of heaven is as a man traveling into a far country, who called his own servants and delivered unto them his goods. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to every man according to his several ability. And straightway he took his journey. Then he that had received the 5 talents went and traded with the same, and made them other 5 talents. That's an interesting expression, and I don't know if you've ever really just focused in on this man and thought, now what did he do? What did he do to take this 5 talents and make 10 out of it, to double it? I don't know how much money you've got in your savings account, but it would be kind of nice to double it, wouldn't it? It'd be kind of pleasant to have just that much more of a little cushion to fall back on. Well, I suspect, he might have, if you were doing this today, you'd take your however many dollars it was that you had, you'd go down here to the East Texas auto auction, walk in there with your $500, and bid on some old clunker and buy it for $450. All right, you take it, you drive down the street, you hope it doesn't fall apart, you go down, you clean it up a little bit, maybe put a little of your own work into it, you go and you sell it to somebody for $800. Bingo, you've made a nice little $350 profit. Then you take the money and say, now let's see, what else can I do? And you take this money that you just got, you go back and you maybe buy another one, or maybe rather than even selling the car, you trade it for another car because you really think that, and maybe a little money to boot, then you put that money in the new car, and then you trade that new car off, or this other one you bought, and you work your way around through this whole thing. And when all is said and done, you sell the final car after all these trades, and you've wound up picking up $2,000 neat profit when you only started off with $500. Now that sounds good, doesn't it? And there are people who do that all the time. Why don't more people do it? Well, the answer is very simple. Because there's a risk involved in it. It's very possible you may not be able to make that trade at an advantageous. You may not be able to find a bigger fool than you are. That's what's called the bigger fool theory. You pay a high price and hope that a bigger fool will come along and pay a higher price for it. All right? You may not be able to find that person. Or you may go down to the auction, you may bid on your car, you may drive it out in the street, and you got the third traffic light. When you start pulling away, the transmission falls out of it, right in the pavement. Just all kinds of pieces, and little nuts and bolts rolling out in front of the car. And you've lost the whole thing. So there is a risk that this person who made the additional or who doubled his money had to take some chances to double that money. It was not just merely a matter that he was, let's say sharper or better. It does say he gave to each man according to his several ability. But I think we need to understand the relationship that was here. All right? The other man, likewise, he that had received two, he gained other two. He also doubled his money. But he that had received the one went and digged in the earth and hid his Lord's money. Now, after a long time, the Lord of these servants comes and reckons with them. And so he that had received 5 talents came and brought another 5 talents, saying, Lord, you delivered unto me 5 talents. Behold, I have gained beside them 5 talents more. He said, Well done, you good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a few things. I will make you a ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. He went to the man that had gained 2 talents. Did the same thing. Same reply. It would appear that these men, having different abilities and having different things to work with, both of them doubled their money, and both of them received the same reward. It didn't matter that the one had created 5, the other had created 2. God looked at what they had to work with and rewarded them exactly the same. Look what he says then. He said to this other man that comes along in verse 24, He that had received the 1 talent came and said, Lord, I knew you, that you are a hard man, reaping where you have not sown, and gathering where you have not strawed. I was afraid, and went and hid your talent in the earth, and lo, there you have that which is yours. His Lord answered and said unto him, You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I sow not, and gather where I have not strawed. You ought to have put my money to the exchangers, so that at my coming I could have received my own with usury, with interest. Therefore take the talent from him that has this talent, and give it to him that has 10 talents. For unto every one that has shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that has not shall be taken away even what he has. Now, honestly, humanly speaking, that does not really seem fair. It just doesn't really seem fair. Because this fellow gave back exactly what he had been given, didn't he? Well, no, he didn't. No, in fact, he did not. Now, I don't know if you've ever heard the expression, the future value of a dollar, or the present value of a dollar, the expressions that have to do with, if you have a dollar today, what will it be worth in 30 years? Or, if you look ahead 30 years, what is a dollar 30 years from now worth today? How much money would you have to pay today to get that dollar 30 years from now? And the whole concept is that a dollar invested today at a certain rate of interest is worth considerably more than that 30 years from now. Meaning simply this, that money should work, and that therefore that money should produce additional wealth by the fact that it does work. Now, what then happens? I can explain it to you very easily this way. I give you $100, and I say to you, do the best you can with this $100. Well, you've heard stories about banks going folding, and you realize that you can go down and put it in your savings account, and you can pull down 5 3/4%, and that sounds like a pretty good deal in a way, and yet banks have been robbed, or banks have have folded, and you're not even sure about the Federal Depositors Insurance Corporation. So one thing you can do, that you can go out and bury that so deep in your backyard that it isn't even worth $100 to somebody to dig it up. And so you do that. You go out and you bury it down there, and you tamp the earth down carefully on top of it, and you keep lights on the backyard every night anyway in your home. There isn't any way anybody's going to get that. And so you leave it there for a year or 2 years or 3 years, and you know that when you go out there and dig that up, you're going to have your money, right? Wrong. Absolutely wrong. All the time that you had it down there, someone was stealing a little bit of it every day. Who was that someone? Inflation. Inflation. When you dig it up, and you take that $100 down somewhere to buy something with it, you can no longer buy with it what you could have bought with it when you stuck it in the ground, because inflation has destroyed a certain amount of it. Now, I think all of us can understand that. And I presume there must have been some inflation going on back at this time for this situation perhaps to exist, but even if it did not, the expectation was that that money given to a person as a steward, and that man is to be responsible for that money, means that he was to put the money to work, and that if he did not, that the owner of the money has suffered loss as a result of his failure to do this. Now, what am I trying to tell you through all of this? I'm trying to tell you that it is necessary, if you are to produce, to take risks. You have to take chances. Now, anyone who has studied investments or has been involved in investments in any way realizes that you can actually earn, you have the possibility of earning more than that 5.25% or 5.75% on your money that you have right there in your account. We all know that, don't we? Well, why is it then that people don't earn more than that? Because it's possible. There are places you can put your money that have the possibility of returning 15% or 20% within a year, and there are other places you can put it that have the possibility of doubling it in a year. And we could pull out some stock charts and show you some common stocks that have, in many cases, doubled and redoubled within a 12-month period of time. Now, of course, there's one small problem, that those stocks that go up fast also go down fast. And those stocks that go up slowly usually go down slowly. And so, if I can take you to the stock market, take you down to the broker and sit you down, and he opens up his little charts and his books, and he says, now, here are some stocks, and here are some investments. He wants to know, now, are you going to be an aggressive investor? Are you going to play it safe? Do you want to take, what kind of return are we looking for? And you have to operate on what's called the risk-reward principle. That the higher the reward you want, the greater the risk you have to take. It's almost as though there was a law, isn't it? That you have to take a risk if you want a reward to come your way. And the greater the reward you want, the greater the risk you must take. Speaking financially, of course. Now, does this apply in any way other than financial? Well, before I try to answer that question, let's turn to the other parable that's along the same line and look at the slightly different principle that's there in the 19th chapter of Luke. Luke chapter 19, and beginning in verse 12. He said, therefore, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and to return. He called his 10 servants and delivered them 10 pounds and said to them, occupy till I come. So they each got 1 pound apiece. This is a little different principle now involved from the one before, where the people received differential amounts of money based upon their ability. All right? But his citizens hated him and sent a message after him saying, we will not have this man to reign over us. And it came to pass that when he was returned, having received the kingdom, he commanded these servants to be brought to him, to whom he had given the money, that he might know how much every man had gained by trading. Then came the first saying, Lord, your pound has gained 10 pounds. Now, if you think about that, you have to realize this man took an enormous risk in order to produce that 10 pounds. In fact, the chances are about 10 times greater that he would have lost that money totally than the man who was only able to double the pound. He had to take that kind of a risk. He went around looking for investments that might produce 2%, others that might have produced 10%, others that might have produced 100%. He wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted an investment that would produce 1,000% in the time allotted, however long it was. Now, those of us who know a little bit about investing realize that he also had a 10 times greater chance of loss than the man who only was trying to double it during that period of time. Now, what is the response then to this man when it all comes through? Well, let's wait and see as we come down to it. Anyway, he says, you have been faithful in much. He said to him, well, you good and faithful servant, because you have been faithful in very little, verse 17, you have authority over 10 cities. Then comes one with 5, and he had gained, one that had gained 5, and he gave him authority over 5 cities. Now we see that it is the gamblers who got the greatest reward. Pardon me for saying that, but that is precisely the case. They had to take a much greater chance in addition to working harder. I have no doubt that hard work was involved in it. But I also have no doubt that they took a chance. They stuck their neck out a country mile. And the greater the produce, the greater the reward. It's the risk-reward principle. Now be assured that these men were not just doing this merely by going out with sweat and labor, because the other parable says they traded with this money. And any time you're doing that, you're taking a chance with what you're doing. And there wasn't any point in giving these people a pound to work with if you didn't expect them to put that pound at risk in some way. If it's just a matter of their own labor and their own sweat, don't give them anything. Just say, go to work and give me what you earn, right? So there isn't any doubt about it. These men were given the pound or the talents to risk them in the possibility of a greater reward. In the response from their Lord when he came back, authority over 10 cities, authority over 5 cities. But another one came and said, Lord, here's your pound which I kept laid up in a napkin. For I feared you, because you are an austere man. You take up where you don't lay down, and you reap where you don't sow. And he says, I'll judge you out of your mouth, you wicked and slothful servant. Notice, slothful. You know, it actually doesn't say slothful in this particular one, did the other one. You knew that I was an austere man, taking up what I laid not down, and reaping what I did not sow. Why didn't you give my money into the bank? Okay, so there's a little bit of risk in the bank, but there's a chance of making something on it. So that at my coming, I might have required my own with interest. He does the same thing. He takes a pound away from him, and he gives it to who? To the man who had produced the most. And by the laws of economics, it would seem, the man that took the biggest chances along the way was the man he gave it to. What kind of a personality profile would you draw for the man that gained 10 pounds as opposed to a man that gained 5, as opposed to a man who only gained 1? What kind of people do you suppose they were? I would say that that guy who took 10 pounds was pretty aggressive and the kind of person that you might very well see sitting at the blackjack table in Las Vegas. He's the kind of a man who is willing to stick his neck out and to take a chance. And what happens? I mean, what's God's attitude toward it? Well, this is the man that he took the pound away from, and he gave it to the man who produced the most. Now, all this time we've focused on the fact that the man produced the most, without considering the fact that he probably, without any doubt, also took the biggest chances of anybody that was involved in any of the things that were going on here. Well, I think we need to realize that, even in today's economy, that if you just start sticking things away in your savings account, and you think, well, my money is secure. It's in an insured savings account. FDIC's got it insured up to $40,000, and since I've only got $400, I'm a long way from ever getting any chance of having more money than's insured in my bank and so on. And you're just go on your way just merrily and happily assuming that your money is secure. But you're drawing down 5 1/4 or 5 3/4, depending on where you are, and inflation's going up at 7 or 8 or 9. And what's the end result? You're going backwards. You're going backwards. The only thing you're accomplishing is you're not going backwards as fast as you would if you had it in a coffee can under your bed. Then you'd be going backwards 9% per year. Now you're only going backwards 2, 2 1/4, 2.5% per year with the money that you're sticking away somewhere along the line. One of the things that, a lesson that I think we need to learn is the fact that being security conscious, apart from the fact that you tend to be a little staid and you maybe don't accomplish the great reward, there is the possibility, enormous possibility of great loss that come our way from being too security conscious or from, as I call it, playing it safe. And one of the things that I have been very, very struck by in recent months, and I would say that probably one of the chief reasons why there are not more people with us here today is because they are playing it safe. And they are place of safety oriented. I know of some people I've talked to flat out that they are afraid that if they were here today, that they might somehow next year or the year after or whenever it happens to be, because their name is on the wrong computer, they might not go to a place of safety to be protected from the trials that are going to be coming up on the earth. So they're playing it safe. But what is very fascinating to me is that they have completely forgotten that it is not a question of what card you carry with what union. It's not a question of what computer your name happens to be on. The Bible and the illustrations where they do talk about people being protected, who is it that's protected? Is it a question of which organization they are in, what man they follow, or what card they carry, or is it a matter of their spiritual condition? We know the answer to that. It's clear in the Bible. It is not a matter of your church or your local church or where you were born or what age you lived in. It is a matter of the kind of a person you are and your relationship with Almighty God. That's what makes the difference. It's not a question of anything else. So if you are thinking in terms of being safe and protecting your family and everything being right, the problem is not to be right with an organization. The problem is to be right with God. To be sure, to be absolutely sure that when you come on your knees before Him and you lift up your face and say, "My Father in heaven," He says, "Oh, I know you." Or that you're not one of those to whom He says, "What was that name again? I don't believe we've met." Because something a little harsher than that is what Christ says to those who were out of pocket with Him when the time of the wedding supper comes. And as I said, when I say out of pocket, I want to emphasize, out of pocket with Him and with those to whom He comes. And it is not a matter of who you know as far as people in this world is concerned. It's a matter of who you know in heaven that is the important criterion in that. And so anyway, the concept, and it is as though there is a law, I mean a very fundamental law in the Scripture and in human affairs, that the person who is too security conscious, the person who plays it cozy and plays it safe and can't take the risks, inevitably loses out to the person who takes the big chances. I'm studying World War II, and I've read a great deal of the works, the lives, the activities of the great generals of World War II, and I've had to also come to realize over a period of time that probably the greatest military mind of all time is Satan the devil. He is a genius at military affairs. Someday I want to write a book about Satan, and I want to go through and begin to point out maybe for people with some things they have never seen about Satan's devices and to understand how he works and the subtleties. And some of the things I frankly never would have seen, and I really began to tumble onto them as I was reading through some of the works of the great military minds of this century. I've never taken the time, and someday I wish to do so, and go back and study the military minds of previous generations as well, to begin to find out and may perhaps learn a bit more. It is interesting that you do not, generally speaking, find among the great generals such as MacArthur or Patton or Eisenhower, you do not find atheists or cynics. You find religious men. Sometimes they are all the way into mysticism, as was Chinese Gordon. They are a strange breed. The awareness of God, the awareness of the spirit world, very profound in these men. George Patton, for example, really believed, at least he said he believed, that he was a reincarnation of generals past. As he was bouncing down a road in Europe one night, he asked to one of the men, to his driver, he says, "Is there a theater over here?" And the man, it's strange. Here they are in the wilderness, almost in the countryside, and there's no city there. And he's asking, "Is there a theater?" And he's not asking a theater of war, he means a theater over there. And the driver says, "How could there be?" And he says, "Stop the Jeep." And they screeched to a stop, and they got out, and they walked over a little knoll, and there were the ruins of an old Roman theater. Roman theater. And he said, "I stood there with his hair standing up on the back of his neck with a realization he had been there before." And it really makes you wonder sometimes how many times these great military minds, these geniuses, are actually perhaps driven by or led by a spirit that has been active in another military leader at another time in another place. But anyway, that's something that I really want to look into and spend some time with, and perhaps write some more work on it, do some more writing on it later. But one of the things that I have been struck by, as far as generals, as far as the military, is the fact that it is the aggressive, it is the risk taker, is the one who wins in these situations, and the one who plays it safe is usually the one that loses out. The great generals like Rommel were daring, exciting individuals. They were the kind of man who would risk everything on a throw of the dice. They threw themselves into these things with incredible abandon and danger. There was a particular occasion that I found that I was struck by, and I just read it not that long ago. In fact, my wife found it. She was digging around in here for me trying to find some material on the booklet that I wanted to write about Satan. But General Patton had just been appointed as the commanding general of the Third Army. And it was on the eve of the Third Army becoming operational. It was being put together in Europe. And of course, all through even before the war, he was a man who did not play with the rules. someone would lay out the rules even for a war game, and they would, if they left any kind of a loophole at all, and sometimes even if they didn't leave a loophole, Patton would take his tanks where tanks were not supposed to go. He would take them outside of the boundaries. He would come completely around on great forced marches and be where nobody ever believed he could possibly be. He threw maneuvers into total chaos time and time again because he was willing to take chances with his tanks. It took them through swamps where tanks were supposed to get bogged down, but he knew what the risks were. And he knew he was taking a chance, but he knew nobody would believe he would come through that way. He went where people didn't believe that he would go. And so, as he was about to take over the Third Army, and of course the whole campaign in Europe had to do with the kind of risks that this man was willing to take. He had his orders, and then he had his plans. And sometimes his orders and his plans didn't exactly match. But he generally felt that his plans were better than his orders. And more often than not, the man was right. Well, on the eve of his Third Army's becoming operational, he felt history breathing down his neck. He was thinking of Lady Macbeth's words to Ross, quote, "Stand not upon the order of your going, but go at once." But he still had 12 hours to kill, and now he was trying to fend off the mounting suspense of those dragging hours. In his efforts to calm the tension within him, he brought out the belongings of his dead friend, Colonel Flint, and began to sort them out for shipment to Patty's widow in Vermont. Despite his inner turmoil, Patton was relatively composed. He had his orders and had made his arrangements. There was not always perfect harmony between the two, for Patton usually thought his own arrangements represented a vast improvement over his orders. Now, too, in his nocturnal solitude, he knew exactly what he would do and how he would do it. He was determined to do it so fast, with such finality, that those timid souls hovering over him would not be able to stop him or alter the accomplished fact. They were trying to tell him to slow down, take it easy, back off, go this far, stop here. And he looked at them and knew they were wrong. He knew they were wrong. That being timid at a time like this, when men's lives were at stake, was the wrong way to go. Patton even had the sign which he and his innate mysticism always needed to reassure himself that he was on the right track. When he had burst into 8th Corps headquarters, General Middleton received him with what seemed to be a sigh of relief. "I'm glad to see you, George," Middleton said, "because here we are with a lot of loose ends and I don't know what to do. I've been trying to get a hold of Bradley, but I can't find him. His orders to me were to secure the line of the Saloon River, and now we have secured it, but what am I supposed to do next?" Patton asked, "Are you across, Troy?" "No, Brad didn't tell me to cross the river." Patton responded, quote, "Throughout history, it has always proved fateful to stop on the wrong side of a river. I'll tell you what to do next, Troy. Go across. At once." "I can't do it without Bradley's okay," Middleton said. Patton replied, "Well, I won't be taking over officially till tomorrow noon, but I've actually taken over on the 28th. So I am telling you on that authority, go across right away." He exceeded his orders, he exceeded his authority, but he took what little authority he thought he had somewhere, and he overrode what the man's objections were and said, "Go across at once." "But the bridge is out," Middleton said, still objecting. Just then, as if Patton had arranged it, 2 messages came in over the telephone. One reported that the bridge at Pont Hobo had been damaged but was still usable. The other said the 4th Armored Division had captured the 2 dams to the east of Avranches, and it was possible for troops to move across them. "I consider this an omen of the future success of the Third Army," Patton said, or later wrote, as usual, mixing fatalism and pragmatism. "I directed that the 8th Corps start across that night, which it did. Had we failed to secure a bridgehead that night, our whole operation would have been jeopardized." And he goes on to explain more about why he stretched his orders, why he felt he had to do what he had to do, and there is no doubt that he was right. And you stop to think about that as one coming to the river, coming right up to it, and then this bridge is out, but he doesn't even inquire as to whether there are other bridges because he has no orders to cross the river. It has been suggested that one of the reasons why we finally were able to win the war in Europe was because of the inflexibility of the German high command, particularly with Hitler involved in it, and of the German soldiery, and their unwillingness to take chances that people like Patton, Eisenhower, and others were willing to take along the way. It's a real striking lesson, I feel, and I thought his remark about how fatal it is to stop on the wrong side of the river or to be caught on the wrong side of the river at the beginning of a campaign, and the realization that here's a great military mind speaking, and yet I'm afraid sometimes you and I maybe today think, well, I'm not military. I'm a civilian. And you don't realize, no, you're not. In the war that you and I are engaged in, there are no non-combatants. We are all soldiers. We are all on the firing line, and our enemy doesn't care whether you wear a uniform or whether you don't. And when he starts a campaign, he doesn't declare war. He doesn't tell you what he's going to do. He prepares for it for years. One of the reasons why I was kind of wondering whether or not the thing that's coming off in California now would succeed is because I knew that some of the principals that were involved in it have been preparing for it for years and knew what they were going to do. And I think maybe their preparations may have been insufficient. It looks that way as we go along with developing with it. But it now, looking at consideration and knowing who our enemy is and knowing his preparation and knowing that he is a genius at military matters, it's really kind of stupid in the way for us to try to sandbag it and maybe not realize that here we have a chance, here we have a place where we could be breaking through, and we haven't done it. And there are many people today, as I said, who are not supporting what we are doing down here in Tyler, not because they disagree with us, not because they feel that we are wrong, not because they feel that anything being preached is wrong, but because of timidity, because of fear, because they have been made afraid. You know that if a general can make you believe that he has an army flanking you on the east, and they are there, they're behind a ridge, you can't see them, and if it comes to the place where he can make you believe that they are there, it is just as good as if they were there. It doesn't make any difference whether they are there or not. There could be nothing there but sham. But if you believe that they are there, they are there. And they are a factor in the events that are going to begin taking place. And if Satan can make people afraid, if he can make them timid, if he can cause them to back off, if he can keep them on the wrong side of a river, the wrong side of a bridge at a critical time, he's won. Fear, timidity, the exploitation of timidity is one of the most effective weapons that he uses. And in wartime, with men like as Patton, MacArthur, and others have learned long since, that half the battle is psychological. Half the battle is what the enemy believes. And knowing your enemy and not overestimating your enemy and not underestimating your enemy is of vital importance. MacArthur commented on two generals that he had to work opposite in the Pacific. And he was talking, this was talking about the First World War in Europe, where he was a very active young officer in the First World War. And he was commenting about the weakness of two French generals, both of whom were fine men, fine leaders of men, but he said they had a fatal weakness. They tended to consistently overestimate their enemy, and consequently they failed to push on and exploit their gains and their successes when they had the chance to do so. General MacArthur, on one occasion in World War I, had just managed to cross a river with his troops. And the question arose at that point, because the Germans were in some disarray in front of them, was whether or not to stop, to secure the bridgehead, to make everything ready in this particular situation, play it safe, or whether to pursue them. His troops pursued 4 days and 4 nights. And finally, when he was able to get the commanding general to report on what they had done, as they had proceeded, not playing it safe, but taking appalling risks with his men, pursuing vigorously after the Germans, he fell asleep in a chair while he was making his report because he hadn't slept hardly at all for 4 days. The general looked at him and said, well, it looks like I'm going to have to give him another Silver Star. And he did. I don't know how many times MacArthur was decorated during that war, but he was an aggressive, risk-taking leader. You know, it's the only, when you're dealing with human lives, and that was his thought. His realization was it was very dangerous for him and his men. But it was going to be a question later on of many more thousands of lives than they were risking at that point that would have been lost if they did not pursue this thing on through to wherever it was going to go. You think about Harry Truman and the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Nagasaki or Hiroshima. And what they were doing was trading off the lives of those hundreds of thousands of people against the lives of perhaps millions of people in a protracted, drawn-out war. Did they take a risk? Yeah, sure did. Because many people today, you know, still would think and look upon him as the man who wiped out hundreds of thousands of lives in the first use of nuclear weapons in warfare. But you know, as I said before, it is almost as though there was a law underlying all of this. The timid soul loses all law, if you might call it that. And that really, it's expressed fairly well in the Bible. I want you to turn back to the book of Mark, to the 8th chapter, and the 34th verse. When he had called the people unto him with his disciples, he said unto them, Whosoever will come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. He that would seek to save his life shall lose it. But whoever will lose his life for my sake and the gospel shall find it. There is a simple statement of the law of the timid soul, if you will. That the person who wants to put up the sandbags and dig the trenches and get his defensive positions all taken care of and say, I've got to save my life. I've got to protect myself. I'm concerned about me and my family and my children. The statement is, he that would seek to save his life shall lose it. And it might read, but whosoever shall risk his life for my sake and the gospel's shall find it. So I asked the question before, what personality profile would you draw of the person who is going to be in the kingdom of God? Or maybe we might ask ourselves, what personality profile would you draw of a man of a man of God? A man whom God would respect and appreciate, a man whom God would use. There was a young man once named David, selected by God, anointed by Samuel, to be a king, following on the heels of a man called Saul, who had disqualified himself from serving God any further. It is fascinating to study that whole thing and to look at the rejection of Saul, and a very interesting study at this point. And one wonders, why David was somehow better in God's eyes than Saul. And the human tendency is always to look for the righteous man. The man this man sins, therefore he's not any good, or that man sins more, or he's worse. And never realized that it wasn't Saul's sins. It wasn't David's sins that had made the difference, that God realizes that all men sin. We all make mistakes. We all are foolish in that regard. But the fact is that Saul was given a job to do, and he didn't do it. The reason why God rejected him and took his spirit away from him was because he did not carry out the mission that he was given. I think it's a profound truth, and one that needs to be understood and thought about very deeply. And when God gives a person a commission, and the spirit that is given to a person, do we realize why God gives his spirit in this way? Why he gave it to Saul in the first place? It was because of things that he wanted Saul to do. Why has he given us his spirit? Why, for all these 40 years now, 44, or nearly going on 45 years, in the work of God, have we had the Spirit of God and the Spirit of wisdom and have made some uncannily correct decisions? Year after year after year, growing in excess of 20%, 25%, maybe hitting 30% somewhere along the line, I don't know. We had to be doing something right. We were. Now, if you begin to think, why would God then ever take his Spirit away? There's only one reason. It has nothing to do with the fact that we might be weak, or we might sin, or we might make mistakes. It has to do with whether or not we are doing his job, whether we are doing what we were given to do, whether we are carrying out the task or not. Because the Holy Spirit is not given to us for our entertainment. It is not given to man for them to stand up and speak in tongues and say what a wonderful time they had at prayer meeting on Wednesday night, and all of us, go through this great experience with one another. The Holy Spirit is not given to men for them to somehow just turn inward in themselves and study and pray and become hermits somewhere. The Holy Spirit is given to us, every one of us, man, woman, and child. God will not give his Spirit, of course, until we have come to the place of repentance, which children really do not understand. But the reason why that Spirit is given is to use. It is for a work. It is for a job. And if you want to lose it, the way you lose it is not to do the work, not to fulfill the calling, not to follow through when God has given you something to do. David was a born gambler. He was the sort of person who took chances. Remember the occasion when Goliath is taunting the troops, and David stands up there and says, "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should taunt the armies of the living God?" That just from the heart it came out, who is this man that he can do this? They took him into Saul. He said, "I'll fight him. I'll go down and fight this man." And Saul said, "You're just a youth." And he said, "I have kept my father's sheep." And there came a lion and a bear on one occasion to attack the flock. And he says, "And I defended it, and I killed them both." He stuck his life right on the line with those animals. Bears are dangerous, so are lions. And he actually killed 2 wild animals that were after his father's flock. He didn't do that while he was climbing a tree to try to save his own life. No. And he wasn't trying to save his own life. Wasn't even thinking in terms of his own life. It didn't even occur to him, I don't think, that he would lose to Goliath. And so he went down to fight him. And I don't recall, does the Scripture really tell us that there was a miracle involved in Goliath's death? Because it tells us he just took the smooth stones. He was a skilled marksman, and he put that thing right in that giant's forehead. And I would have presumed, judging the way it says the stone sunk in, that he threw it hard. Now, I'm sure God was with him, and I'm sure God was protecting him, but I am not sure that God had to do anything, to even lift a finger or to speak a word. Because this man, I don't know, it is almost as though there is something with the person who will stick his neck out for God. It is almost as though there is something with the person who will stick his neck out for man. It is almost as though there were a natural law at work, that the timid lose out and the aggressive, risk-taking person goes forward. It seems to work that way. I think it's fascinating to watch it and see how it actually develops in the lives of so many people. There was another man named Daniel. I'm sure you're familiar with him. They were trying to find some reason or some way they could get at Daniel because he was just too powerful in the kingdom. And they decided what we will do is, because the only way we're going to get at him is by something having to do with his God. He's just got too much reputation. There's too much integrity there. What we will do, and they arranged that a decree would be signed, that any man who asked a petition of God or man for 30 days would be put to death, be thrown in the den of lions. Now, the Scripture tells us, when Daniel heard that the writing was signed, he knew that it was a fact. He went into his chambers with the windows open, and he got down on his knees, and he prayed just like he always did before. He did not even close the windows. He apparently did not even lower his voice, but prayed aloud to God as he had done before. A very reckless thing to do. And they broke in on him, and they took him, and they put him in the lion's den, and you know the story. The lion's den was Daniel's place of safety. No one was going to bother him there. And so I assume he slept the night out. I could always like to visualize him lying there with using a lion's haunch for a pillow during the night. Maybe cuddling up to one of those warm kitties and really enjoying the presence of some honest people for a change. At least there were no politics going on down in there. And so he was let out a free man. There were these three fellows, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who again, they knew that everybody was supposed to bow down to this golden idol when they heard the sound of the instruments of music. And so here they were out there, and everybody went down. Here were these three people standing up. An appalling risk. I mean, surely God will understand. We'll just sort of hunker down here, and nobody will notice, and God will forgive us, and it'll be all right. And I don't know, maybe God would have forgiven them as far as that's concerned. But they weren't even thinking in those terms. They drug him up before the king and says, now you've got to do this. They said, I'm sorry, we can't do this. Our God says this, and we can't do it. He said, but I can throw you into this fiery furnace. We know that. We still can't do it. He says, your God can't save you. And their reply finally almost exasperated, saying, look, even if God doesn't save us, be it known to you, O king, we will not bow down to your idol. The wording of it, you can't tell what their tone of voice was, but the wording of it is pretty clear. They were coming back and saying, okay, we have said God will deliver us. You say God won't deliver us, and I want you to understand this. Even if he doesn't deliver us, we're not going to do it. An appalling risk that they were taking with this man. And sure enough, into the fiery furnace they went. And that turned out to be their place of safety, because no one could come after them there. The things that had bound them were burnt off, and they were free, and they were loose, walking about in the midst of the fire, and there was a fourth person in there with them during that period of time. Remarkable occurrence, an astonishing occurrence, but that is the way God works. And these men, these powerful examples out of the Bible, took appalling risks, seemed very reckless with their lives. I want you to turn back now to Nehemiah. I've just told you these stories, but there's one I want you to read, and there are a couple of statements out of it that I think are very important. In the 6th chapter of Nehemiah, they were, I think, in a lot of ways in a very similar situation to what we're in today. They were building. They had come back to the city of Jerusalem. They had finished the walls, but they had not yet been able to put up the gates of the city. It came to pass when Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arabian and the rest of our enemies heard that I had built the wall, and there was no breach left in there, but I had not yet got the gates up, Sanballat and Geshem sent unto me, saying, Come, let's meet together in some one of the villages in the plain of Ono. But they sought to do me mischief. They were just trying to drag him away from the wall, and they were definitely going after him. Then I sent messengers to them, saying, I am doing a great work. I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? We're trying to drag him away from what he really was sent down here, what he came down here to try to do. And so he goes on to say, they sent unto me 4 times after this sort, continually harassing him is what they were doing. And I answered them after the same manner. Then sent Sanballat his servants unto me in like manner the 5th time with an open letter in his hand, wherein was written, It is reported among the heathen, and Gashmu saith it, that you and the Jews are planning to rebel, for which cause you're building the wall that you may be their king, according to these words. Now come the rumors. Now come the insinuation. Now come the little putting in the knife and trying to turn it along the way. And he says, they go on to say, you have appointed prophets to preach of you in Jerusalem, saying there's a king in Judah. And now it's going to be reported to the king, now, come on down, let's talk about this thing so it doesn't take place. And I said to him, there are no such things as you say, but you have feigned them out of your own heart. Then he comments, for they all were trying to make us afraid, saying their hands will be weakened from the work that it be not done. Then comes Nehemiah's prayer, now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. Now afterward, a little later, I came to the house of Shemaiah, the son of Deliah, who was shut up, and he said, now let's meet together in the house of God within the temple, and let's shut the doors of the temple, for they're going to come to slay you. Yea, in the night will they come to slay you. Beautiful. Now they've tried everything else. Now they're going to start dropping little hints, innuendos. Boy, you're going to get dangerous. It's bad. You could be killed. This thing could happen to you. Listen to Nehemiah's answer. I said, should such a man as I am flee? You know what kind of person I am? Should I flee? And who is there, being in my position, who would go into the temple to save his life? I'm not supposed to be in that place. And I'm supposed to set that kind of an example. He said, I will not go in. Because I perceived that God had not sent him. He pronounced this prophecy against me because these other men had hired him, and it was true. Therefore was he hired that I should be afraid and do so and sin, that they might have matter for an evil report, that they might reproach me. My God, think you upon Tobiah and Sanballat according to their works, and on the prophetess Noadiah, and the rest of the prophets that would have put me in fear. So, the wall was finished in the 25th day of the month of Elul in 52 days. It's a fascinating story to me, and it's one of the very interesting examples of the way Satan likes to work. And he hasn't changed. God's the same yesterday, today, and forever, and so's he. And he's out trying to do whatever he can. First of all, to distract and waste time. Second, to pull somebody away and try to incriminate them in something. Third, innuendos and hints and ideas of wrongdoing. And then finally, little veiled threats as personal safety. All of it designed to weaken somebody's hands, to turn people's minds away from the work, to pull them down from what they're trying to do so that it isn't done. Satan doesn't need to actually destroy you or take you out of whatever it is. All he needs to do is to get you paralyzed with fear so you can't do it. If he can immobilize you with fear, he has succeeded, and he needs to do no more. He needs go no further. He need take no other risk. If you stop, if you quit, if you hide out, and that, my brethren, is the object of the exercise. Realize that it takes a gambler to take certain kinds of risks for God, that the people who play it safe, the people who hide out in the closet at home, the people who are afraid of the dark or afraid of their own shadows or afraid of some man who says, I'm going to disfellowship you, or I'm going to do this to you, or I'm going to shut you off from your brethren, or I'm going to, whatever they have to say, that people who are afraid don't do things like this. It takes a person who is willing to be reckless at times. It takes a person who's willing to lay his life on the line. It takes a person who's willing to lay his fortune on the line. It takes a person who's willing to put whatever it takes on the line. And I fear that too often we somehow get so conservative in our orientation and so security conscious and so much concerned with saving our own hide And just ask yourself how many people you know who aren't here today, or who aren't didn't attend the feast in Jekyll Island, because they were afraid. How many people do you know who were not there because they really honestly believed it was the wrong place to be? Not too many. There were some. But far more who were not there simply because they were afraid. I think it's interesting to see. Many people don't seem to realize that fear is the enemy of a Christian. Remember over in Revelation, the 21st chapter, where it says that the fearful and the unbelieving shall have their part in a lake of fire? That it is those who Satan is able to immobilize by fear who are going to be the ones who wind up getting left behind. I think it's rather strange, and it's a remarkable thing to come to consider, that while the fear of God is clean, and it's a good thing to fear God, and anytime anyone tries to use fear beyond that, pointing people to God and say, fear Him, anytime they go beyond that, that is not of God. Not of God at all. Turn back to 2 Timothy, if you would, to the first chapter. In verse 6 he says, wherefore I put you in remembrance, that you stir up the gift of God which is in you by the putting on of my hands. For God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Understand and know this. The fear of God is clean. No, there any other fear that is attempted to be used by some minister or non-minister or anyone else who uses against you in your life, it is not of God or of God's Spirit. No way. I think it's really important, frankly, for us to take a look at this from another point of view. And I want to ask one very important question of you at this point. And I think maybe it's one that you've thought about, been hanging in the back of your mind through some of the things, going back to the parables. Let's suppose that you took these risks, you got this pound in your hand and say, okay, I want 5. I want 5, and I know where I can go to get it. Maybe I can get 5. I know there's a chance, but I'm going to try it, I'm going to do it. And you go and you take the chance and you lose it. And then you've got to come back before God, not with one that you had buried in the ground somewhere, but absolutely empty-handed. What then? Let us suppose, I've been telling you all day long, take these chances, and all I've given you up until this point is examples of people who succeeded. Let us suppose you take one of these chances and you fail. What happens if I stick my neck out and it all goes wrong? There is a beautiful story in the Bible of a young man who frankly got tired of sitting around at home and said, Dad, I want my part of the inheritance and I want it now. And his dad was hurt and puzzled and didn't really understand, but he said, well, okay. And he made the division of the inheritance between his sons, and this kid took his in his hand and disappeared down the road, and they saw his dust disappearing over the horizon. During a period of some time, we're told in the parable, he wasted his substance in riotous living. Finally, he came down to the place where a famine hit the land, and he couldn't get work, and he was out of work, and he went to work feeding pigs, and all he was able to eat was the husks that he was pouring out to the figs, and he was starving to death. He took a lot of risk. He went out there with his money, and he probably made some bad investments, and he tried this, and that failed. He lost all of that. He tried over here, and he lost all of that, and he gambled a lot of it away, and he spent a lot of it on wine, women, and song, and finally he's broke. He took great risks. He was a risk-taking person, and he lost it all. One day he says to himself, here I am, in one of the worst jobs a man could ever have, and my father's servants have got bread left over. I know what I'll do. I'm going to go back. I'm not going to ask for my inheritance. I'm not going to ask for any of that. I'm just going to go back, and all I want to be is a servant in my father's house. I'll say, Father, I have sinned against heaven in your sight, and I am no more worthy to be called your son. That's what I'll say. I've got it now. And he starts home. One day his father, at work, looks up, down the road, and he sees him. He's a long way off. He cannot, at this moment of time, answer any question about his attitude. He doesn't know, whether he's changed or whether he's repentant or whether he's good or whether he's bad. He knows one thing. That's my son. And he drops what he has, and he ran to meet him, and he fell on his neck and kissed him. He clothed him with a nice robe. He put a ring on his hand. He killed a fatted calf and threw a giant party for his son when he brought him back home. The question: when you're dealing with God, you were one of the old boys in the parable who was given a pound. You went out all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and you invested it and lost everything, and you come back to God, and you're right behind this guy. This guy comes up and says, here's yours, I have it in a napkin, and here you have what is yours. And he says, you wicked and slothful servant, you didn't even try. He takes it away from him, gives it to the guy that has 10 pounds, and says, throw this man out. You come walking up with nothing. What do you think God's reaction is going to be? I believe with everything in me, he's going to look at you and say, my friend, at least you tried. At least you tried to do what was the best you could do. Come on in. Come on in. I do not believe that the person who is willing to take a chance for God or to stick his neck out for God and tries to do it and believes it's right is ever going to get hurt. Oh, he may lose something here or there. He may have to learn a lesson or two along the way. But he will not lose his relationship with God. And after all, isn't that what it's all about? Isn't that the important thing? I thought about it myself, last summer, when I made a pretty big decision to send in a resignation letter to Mr. Herbert Armstrong in Pasadena. The question had to cross my mind, what if I turn out to be wrong downstream? What if it turns out that actually I'm making a mistake? Maybe all these things I think I know, I don't know. Maybe all that's not true. Maybe this is wrong. Maybe I shouldn't be doing it. Maybe it's wrong. I'll tell you one thing. I didn't try to lie to myself and say that I knew how it was all going to work out. But I did know one thing. I knew that my heart and my attitude toward God was right. And I knew that as long as I was trying, I was better off sticking my neck out for him than I was trying to play it safe. I just don't want to be caught on the wrong side of the river at the beginning of the campaign because I was too timid in playing it safe, unwilling to take a chance maybe and see if I'd get across on the other side before it was all. What's the point of the message that I've given you today? It's real simple. Stick your neck out. Stick your neck out for God. And I don't think you'll ever have to worry. You may lose, you may make a mistake, but the one thing you'll never lose is your relationship between God and you, that he is your father and you are his child.